All right, good morning. Everybody hear me okay? Is the mic on? I need, is it on? They told me to talk? Okay, there we go. Now that's louder, isn't it? All right, great. All right, good morning. My name is Patrick Gray, and I teach at Rhodes College. I was here 1 month ago on February 22nd. I'm going to be here today and next week. So I was here when we started reading the Gospels, and I'll be here, like I said, this week, next week, as we're wrapping up the Gospels. The calendar today says that we're supposed to be talking about Matthew chapters 26, 27, Mark chapters 14, 15, Luke 22, 23, and then John 13 through 19. So the latter part of these Gospels, it's about the Passion narratives. So the ending, and it feels like we ought to be spending more time on this than 1 week, but there's a lot of Bible to cover, so I'm just doing my part here. I want to start actually by reading something that's not in the Gospels. It's from one of the letters of Paul. I've just finished writing a book on Paul, but that's not why I'm reading on that. It's something that's very germane to what we're talking about today. This is in the first chapter of 1 Corinthians, chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. Paul says this, he writes this, "For the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it's the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of the world, or the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, God decided through the foolishness of our proclamation to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs, and Greeks desire wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified. A stumbling block to Jews, foolishness to Gentiles, but to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength." So I want to begin that. He talks about a number of things there. Wisdom, God, Christ. He says a lot in this letter, lots of letters. If you were to say, Paul, break it down for me. Make it a lot simpler, shorter, put it on a bumper sticker. 2 words or less. He could actually do it, right? I mean, if you were to put a gun to Paul's head and say, what is your message? In 2 words, he would say, what does he say there? Christ crucified, right. Christ crucified. He says that's our message. Now, that's not the entirety of the message. Here at the beginning of 1 Corinthians, he talks about Christ crucified. At the end of the letter, chapter 15, he's going to, do the rest. The other shoe to drop, Christ is risen, so he's not going to ignore that. But he says, Christ crucified, that's our message. And he says, I'm trying to bring that message basically to everybody. He identifies a couple of different groups, and you can divide up the world into any number of different kind of categories, right? White, black, male, female, whatever you want to do. From a first century Jewish perspective, the world is divided into 2 parts, Jews and everybody else. Jews, non-Jews. Jews, Gentiles. Here he says Jews and Greeks. And so with those 2 target audiences in view, he says, we bring the message Christ crucified. And he also says, I recognize that strikes a sour chord with, both of those groups. So basically, everyone who hears our message winces a little bit. He says, Jews demand signs, that is to say, demonstrations of great power. And so with that expectation, the message of Christ crucified is not quite what they... in emotional terms, visceral terms, the idea of a man being crucified is powerful. But in real world power terms, you don't get much weaker than someone being tortured to death. That's weakness. If you're looking for strength, that's a stumbling block because that's a real absence of power, right? So he says, for Jews, we give them precisely the opposite of what they are looking for. Greeks, he says, or Gentiles, look for wisdom. Now, there's nothing inherently incompatible between suffering or death and wisdom. And so we're going to be looking at the passion narratives. Passion, means like emotion, right? But it also refers to suffering. the word that we get passion from. And these narratives are about Jesus' suffering and his death. So there's nothing inherently incompatible between suffering or death and wisdom. In fact, there's a proverb in the ancient Mediterranean, to suffer is to learn. So if you don't suffer, then you can't have wisdom. But the way that this seems like foolishness, he says, this seems like foolishness, our message, Christ crucified, it seems like foolishness to Greeks. Who is if you were to poll an ancient Greek audience, who were some wise Greeks? Who's the wisest of all the Greeks? Who might you nominate for that type? Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. I mean, think about, so Socrates was the earliest of all. Socrates, the teacher of Plato. Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. I mean, Socrates was the hero. Everybody wanted, just like everybody wants Jesus on their side. If you're arguing for a position, if you can play the Jesus card, you win that argument, right? If you could have Socrates on your side, you won the argument. Everyone wanted him to be aligned with their school of thought. So Socrates, if you recall, dies, like all people die. All wise men die. But he was also like Jesus in the sense that he was executed. He was sentenced to death. So the difference, though, is Socrates died a very dignified death. He was in control. He was sentenced to drink hemlock. And while he's dying, he's comforting those people around him. They're not comforting him. He is in control of the situation. He's talking to them, giving them teachings, dignified, composed. He's, is the picture of composure. Whereas Jesus screams out, my God, why have you forsaken me? From a Greek perspective, that's not a dignified death. That is not wisdom. That is not the image of the ideal wise man, the ideal sage there. So Paul says our message really doesn't resonate the way we would like it to with anybody. Now, in light of that, he doesn't say we gloss over it, we kind of de-emphasize it, we kind of direct their attention elsewhere. He says, for better or for worse, that's our message. There's no compromising it. And so he actually kind of plays it up. He was aware that it came across in an odd way to much of his audience. And for us, after about 2,000 years, it's very easy to take the cross for granted. Crucifixion kind of equals Jesus or equals Christianity. And it's not until we look at it really closely that we remember or are aware that we take it for granted. If you really examine Jesus' crucifixion closely, it's uncomfortable, right? I mean, I presume no one here has ever witnessed crucifixion. If you recall 10, 11 years ago with the Mel Gibson movie that came out, The Passion of the Christ, I mean, it was called The Passion of the Christ, and it focused on the last 12 hours of his life. And a lot of people did not like that movie. I mean, it made maybe a number of us uncomfortable because it was very, very graphic. It was very, very violent, very, very bloody. I mean, it was a crucifixion after all. But we don't like to kind of look at that. It makes us look the other way. I guess I could show it. We don't have a screen here. I could show that, and that would make a number of you feel uncomfortable. Even without showing it, you can look this up on the internet. There are videos of this or like just kind of script of it. I could give you a detailed medical, just kind of a clinical description of what happens in a crucifixion. Very detailed, and that would make you very uncomfortable to hear about what happens to his internal organs and his nerves and the skin on his back. That would make you uncomfortable. Not because there's anything immoral about talking about it. It's just, a breach of propriety to talk about certain sorts of things, to go into that kind of detail about that kind of physical degradation and humiliation. So I think Paul would not be surprised at that the crucifixion makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable. Like I said, for many of us, you hear the cross, crucifixion, that means Jesus. But of course, Jesus was not the only person to be crucified in the ancient world. So I want to give a little background before we look at these texts in the four Gospels. Crucifixion was a common, well, maybe not a common mode of execution in the ancient world, but it was not terribly uncommon. It was, in Latin, it was called the summum supplicium, the most extreme form of punishment. We have lots of material evidence of crucifixions, where people have, we dig up skeletons and they have nails here and there. So we have lots of examples of this, lots of literary texts talking about crucifixions, talking about certain people who were crucified, and talking about attitudes as well. Like I said, it's called the Summum Supplicium. It was often, this was something you come across, lists of the most horrible ways to be executed. And the cross was number one. To be crucified was the worst death. Number two was usually considered being burned to death. Sometimes that was a method. And number three was decapitation. So I don't know where you would rank those. Those were all pretty horrible forms of punishment. But usually crucifixion was the top of the list. Maybe this is because I'm a father now, but there was actually a penalty for patricide. If you killed your father in ancient Rome, there was a special penalty for that, and it was called the penalty of the sack. And if you were convicted of killing your father, they would have this big leather sack. It had to have been a big sack. The convicted would be put in this sack along with a rooster, a dog, a monkey, and a snake, and they would tie the sack up and throw it in the river. What's so funny about, no, exactly, how did they get everybody in that sack? I would like to see, in what order did they go in? Evidently, it was actually carried out. I can't imagine it was carried out that often, but there are some pretty horrible ways to die. Like I said, now that I'm a father, I kind of think that seems like a pretty just punishment. But he was not Jesus was not the only person to be crucified. Do you know anybody else who was crucified in the ancient world? Or the modern world, for that matter? Any names come to mind? Huh? Peter, yeah. According to ancient tradition, Peter was also crucified with a little bit of a twist, right? I mean, early, upside down. And why upside down? Right, he did not consider himself worthy to die the same death as his master. And so according to tradition, he's crucified upside down in the mid-60s during the reign of Nero. Another one that you may, once I say it, you'll know it. He was a slave. He led a slave revolt in around the year 70 BC. You've seen a movie about him probably. Spartacus. I am Spartacus, that's right. Spartacus was crucified. So this is around 70 AD, just before, so this was a slave revolt that went on for a few years. Spartacus and his men had the Roman Empire, had them on the ropes for a little while. And then the night before the final battle of that slave revolt, Spartacus actually has a Roman soldier who was captured, has him crucified in front of his men, say, if we don't win this battle tomorrow, that's what's going to happen to you. They did not win that battle. And according to a number of ancient sources, 6,000 slaves, Spartacus included, 6,000 slaves were crucified along the Appian Way between Rome and Capua. 6,000 slaves. That's a lot of crosses. I did the math one time, and the distance between Rome and Capua is about the same as the distance between here and Little Rock. Imagine driving about 60 miles an hour between here and Little Rock, about 2 hours, and never going more than 2 or 3 or 4 seconds without another cross coming into view. What kind of an impression does that make? Don't rebel, yeah, especially if you're a slave. Imagine, riding to the big city in a cart with your, it's going to take more than 2 hours, with your master. The impression is you don't try to buck the system. You don't try to rebel against Rome. So they didn't crucify just anybody. These were, not bread thieves here. These were the worst criminals: traitors, murderers, slaves. It was considered appropriate for slaves, not for Roman citizens. It was too humiliating, too disgraceful, too disgusting of a death to inflict on Roman citizens. Justin Martyr, who's a second century Christian writer, dies around 160. Justin Martyr, he's known by that name after his lifetime, obviously. But he talks about this impression that the cross and Jesus' passion made. He said, this is seen as like a mania. This is a type of insanity by non-Christians. They say it's the height of lunacy to put an executed criminal in the place of God, or, in second place, or something really close to God, they see that as a form of insanity. My point here is that if you were going to make up your own religion, this is not something you would make up. This is something that was embarrassing. Again, it's hard to kind of forget about the shock value that would have after 2,000 years. But even people who, in a sense, deny that Jesus was crucified can't deny that there are certain, the basic historicity of it. For example, if you think of Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code, even him, he says, yeah, Jesus was crucified, but he kind of survived the cross. He kind of passed out on the cross and then was brought down and kind of revived, and then went off to France with Mary Magdalene, that sort of thing. And then in many early Muslim and contemporary Muslim telling, Jesus survived the cross or was substituted, Judas was substituted for him at the last minute. Jesus himself was not crucified, but the cross is there at the center of all these different kinds of tellings. All right, so this happened. Jesus died on a cross. About that, there's very little disagreement. What I want to talk about for a few minutes now is, did it happen like this? It happened, but how did it happen? We have 4 different accounts: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John from the first century. And one school of thought goes something like this. We really don't know what happened. We are, the state of our, knowledge here it's very meager. We're really ignorant about what exactly went on around the year 30. And so in this school of thought, we don't know what happened, and there's a good historical reason why we wouldn't know what happened. To know what happened, you would, say this is a court of law. What would, to determine what happened in a court of law, what would you call up here to kind of determine what really happened? You want witnesses, eyewitnesses, right? So according to the narratives themselves in this school of thought, do we have eyewitnesses? Who would be the witnesses? The disciples, right? Well, what do we know about the disciples? They ran away. They abandoned him. So in this school of thought, we don't know what happened because there were no eyewitnesses. All the people who were interested in it, after the fact, were not there. They all ran away. They abandoned him. And so we don't know what happened. Furthermore, in this school of thought, when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the whole narrative is laced with references to Old Testament prophecy. You have all these parallels between things happening in the prophets or statements made by the prophets and Jesus' life or his death here as it's taking place. And so in this school of thought, what we have in the Gospels is not history remembered, it's what is sometimes termed prophecy historicized. That is to say, we have all these Old Testament prophecies, Isaiah, Zechariah, Obadiah, Joel, and we weren't there, we don't know what happened, but we take these prophecies and sort of fabricate a historical narrative out of these prophecies that looks like history, but really it's, like I said, prophecy historicized. But in reality, we don't know what happened. Now, one problem I have with that way of looking at the accounts of Jesus' death here is, in Matthew, for example, Matthew is very fond of saying, here, this happened, and then he explains, this happened in order to fulfill the prophecy that said, and he'll quote Zechariah. In one instance, you have Jesus himself in Matthew chapter 26, Jesus himself saying, all of you will be offended because of me on this night, for it is written, I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered abroad. This is Zechariah chapter 13, verse 7. All right, so think with me here for a minute. Jesus himself in the narrative is saying, you guys are going to abandon me, you're going to desert me, and that's what it says in the prophecies. But according to this theory, we don't know what happened because people deserted. Well, how do we know that they deserted? It's in the narrative. And Jesus himself says, it's been prophesied that you will desert me. Well, if the fact that something is supported by a prophecy is grounds for doubting that it actually happened, what should we doubt here? That they actually deserted him. Now, I think that they actually deserted him, but if your reasoning is things that are mixed, if narratives that are mixed with prophecy can't be historically trusted, except for this one, I guess. I like to call that game heads I win, tails you lose. I'm going to invoke the text when it supports my theory, but not when it doesn't. So I tend to give the gospel writers a little bit more benefit of the doubt. We don't have a lot of external sources for what went on, but we do have these. There are 4 different texts. Look, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Throughout the story up to this point, there's a lot of variation. When you get to the last week of Jesus' life, the 4 different stories, including John, who was really out there compared to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the degree of detail really gets ramped up. The level of agreement really, increases. The order in which events happen. So these are the stories that were written down before anything else. These are the freshest memories, and this was the biggest scandal to be overcome in the earliest church. They got this down. They had to make sense of it. So what I want to do with the rest of our time is, like I said, we just have this one day on the Passion. Just hit some of the highlights, note some things, see what you remember, and talk about some of these things. So let me just first throw this out there. The narratives where they all kind of come together and go into this final week start with something called the anointing at Bethany, where they get together at this house in Bethany, which is close to Jerusalem, and a woman, sometimes it's identified as Mary Magdalene, sometimes not, but a woman comes in with this precious ointment. Do you remember what she do with the precious ointment? Right, she kind of anoints his feet, wash, And do you remember the response to those around to this event? I mean, first of all, it's a little a woman with her feet washed, it's a little inappropriate, right? I mean, so that's but they don't comment on that. They comment on another aspect of it that's a little bit inappropriate or they're uncomfortable with. What is it? This is a very wasteful kind of thing, right? I mean, we could be using, that's like worth 300 denarii. That's a lot of money. We could be doing something else with that, like feeding the poor, it says. Anybody remember who says that? Very good. It's Judas. Often I feel the same way. That's like a big waste of money. And then it's very humbling to kind of, well, that's exactly what Judas said. I guess Judas could get some things right too. But yeah, Judas says, wow, we could use that money to do something really, really good. And Jesus says, no, this is the right thing to do. So there's that scene. And then that kind of merges with the larger, motif of the betrayal. All of the sources agree that Judas betrays Jesus. And that's another thing that they probably would not make up. If you're going to kind of make up something, you're not going to make up something that's potentially embarrassing to you as a group. So why does Judas betray him? Anybody have any ideas? Sometimes the text gives some hints at this, but what are some reasons maybe you've heard or, just kind of thinking up right now? Why? Huh? Yeah, it may be kind of like to force Jesus' hand. And you see this. This may be the message of this ancient document called the Gospel of Judas that was like rediscovered about 10 years ago. Maybe that's what it's trying to say. It's a little unclear. Jesus Christ Superstar, like 1970, 71. That's sort of the image you get of Judas. Judas is frustrated. He can't understand why Jesus doesn't use all this amazing power to overthrow Rome. And it's sort of like, I'm gonna betray you so you will be spurred to movement here. You will do what we need you to do. Maybe that's it. What are some other reasons? The most mundane is it's about money, right? He gets 30 pieces of silver. Later, he has some kind of pangs of remorse, and he tries to return it. So it could be just as simple as it's about the money. Follow the money, right? And So maybe he's not really all that interested in the money that could be, used for the poor. Luke and I think John also has he mentions one thing about what might have motivated him. And it kind of links up with something that happens much earlier in the gospel story. Maybe it's not what made him do it, but who made him do it and who might have made him do it. Something horrible. The worst thing ever, right? The devil. It says, Satan entered into his heart. This is in Luke's gospel. And then he starts to plot to betray Jesus. And so if you were to go back in Luke's gospel, all the way back to one of the very first stories in Luke's gospel, Jesus is tempted by Satan in the desert, and he kind of bests him, in that kind of contest. And then Luke adds, and then Satan departed from him until a more opportune time or something like that. And Satan's absent for several chapters, and he comes back, and is in Luke chapter 22, I think, at this point. And so it says, it's Satan that made him do it. So that then there's a segue from there into the Last Supper. So what are some things you remember about the Last Supper? This is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John is a little bit different. There's this long final meal, but it's not described exactly in the same way that it is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But what are some things you remember from that last night that they spend together indoors in the upper room? Oh, yeah. Well, so I kind of alluded to that with this newly rediscovered a document called the Gospel of Judas, which was probably written in the 4th century, and it kind of disappeared until it wasn't in a safety deposit box on Long Island all that time, but for at least 20 or 30 years it sat there, and then it was published about, I think, 2006 or 2007. And it's a really hard document to understand. It's written in Coptic, and it's just a little bit hard to interpret. And some people interpret it as saying, that Jesus said, somebody's got to betray me to kind of get the kind of the big cosmic ball rolling. You're the one that gets the honor, to do that. Others have said, I'm not sure if it's portraying him as playing this pivotal role. Maybe he's been duped by, others interpret as he's been duped by these kind of demonic forces into doing something that was really, really horrible. It turned out okay. But that's I think, you said in the last decade, and I think that's probably why it's from that interpretation. Yeah.
Why do you need to betray a public figure? Somebody who's out and about all the time. It doesn't seem like he's somebody who needs to be trained. It's not like he's hiding.
That's exactly what he says when they come to him in the garden, too. He says, hey, I've been out here all the time. I've been teaching. Why grab me now? You could have grabbed me at any time. So I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that question. Now, a little, and this kind of relates to the trial, and this is kind of a touchy subject as well. Who crucified people? Who had the jurisdiction? Rome did. Now, the touchy part of it is, to what extent were Jews involved in Jesus' death? And that's touchy because, hey, if you blame, Jews are Christ killers, and so this is, has a long, sordid kind of history. And so people look at these texts and say, well, Romans were the ones who crucified. Jews were not allowed to do that. Well, people do things they're not allowed, but so it says that in the text. Now, Rome was interested in keeping the peace. They didn't terribly care that much about what you believed. And, we have Jews all over the place. As long as they don't create disturbances, and often disturbances were created at Passover in Jerusalem at this time. As long as you didn't create disturbances, they didn't really care that much. Now, and if you were maybe wanting to kind of mess with the Romans, then Romans get really, really involved, and that's when you get crucified, right? So a lot of people look at this and say, this is just kind of retrospectively blaming the Jews. Gentiles become Christians. They don't like Jews, and so they're going to pin it all on the Jews when the Jews really didn't have anything to do with it. Well, all right, well, we can kind of work our way back. I mean, from what we know, Jesus got crucified. They don't crucify people who are jaywalkers, right? He's crucified. What's that sign say over his head? King of the Jews. That's political language. So the question that is out there is, well, did he claim to be King of the Jews? That's kind of a political claim. And remember, that's part of the trial. Jesus is like, or Pilate is, are you King of the Jews? Did you say that? And Jesus kind of says, well, that's what you said. And then Pilate's response, it's a little bit of an ambiguous, evasive sort of response, but Pilate's response to Jesus' response makes it clear that he understands Jesus to be saying, no, he didn't claim to be King of the Jews. But he's crucified. He's crucified. So either Jesus really was a political rebel, intent on causing trouble, or he wasn't. Now, if he wasn't, and yet he was crucified in the way that you would crucify someone who's a political rebel, then either if he wasn't one, then charges were trumped up. Does that make sense? Now, Rome would not be interested in trumping up charges that they knew not to be true just so they could crucify somebody. They had plenty of things to do rather than crucify somebody they knew not to be an actual threat. So if the charges were trumped up, they had to be trumped up by somebody, and so this is where I think historically it makes sense that there was some Jewish involvement by some Jewish leaders. There's lots of kind of infighting among Jews. They were perfectly willing to sacrifice one of their own, so to speak, if it was from a different kind of faction. So I think there probably was some Jewish involvement from some rival group that kind of trumped up charges against him. And then he's betrayed in that sense. So, but the Romans were the ones that put him up on the cross. Other questions about, I kind of went from one thing to another, but other comments or questions about what we've got so far. So it's Passover time, lots of Jews gathered in Jerusalem. Yeah. And that's another thing that Jesus says, why you need all this. But that's another piece of evidence that a lot of people look at and say, well, look, what were they doing with all those weapons? They really must have been a rebel group. And at one point, Jesus is telling them, we're getting into the home stretch here. Be ready for things to go really bad. And some of his followers say, well, we've got a couple of swords, and Jesus says, that's enough. And it's not clear if that's like, okay, now we're ready to go, or just like, you guys just don't understand me once again. That's enough, I'm done, So, so what they would have been, why they came out like that, maybe it's just like overkill kind of police response, something like that. Or, you just kind of, you don't want to leave anything to chance. But I want to come back to what they do with the swords in a minute, yeah. Josephus is a first century Jewish historian, and he mentions Jesus and he mentions that he was crucified. It's like a paragraph. He doesn't go into great detail about it. He does give us some information about how Romans dealt with Jewish kind of uprisings. And sometimes Pilate, according to Josephus, was ruthless and would not have had any qualms about, dropping the hammer. But there are other times where he is chastised by the emperor for unduly antagonizing the Jews at a time like this, and so he's kind of has his wrist slapped. But we don't get a whole lot of details about the crucifixion of Jesus. Does that answer your question? Or Oh, yeah, that had happened, exactly, yeah. There's that paragraph about it, and then maybe it's been messed with a little bit by later Christian writers to say that, and he was the Messiah, but the core of it, yeah, is probably quite historical. So they come to get him in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? And they have those swords, and somebody uses a sword, right? I mean, who uses a sword? Peter, according to some of the, and they all have, him, and he cuts off the ear of one of the soldiers coming out to arrest him. And one of the Gospels adds the detail that it was his right ear. So, we have so little material to work with. Scholars just go crazy with this. And I read one essay where this guy said, well, clearly, what does this tell us about Peter, for example? He must be left-handed. Because if it's his right ear, right, he cuts it off and it must be left-handed. And this article then says, well, and so that's kind of like a implicit way of saying he was left-handed, and so he was unfit to be the high priest and all these kinds of things. It's kind of like building up a big theory on, and even if it's, well, I don't know, as soon as Peter pulls out a sword, if I'm that guy, I'm turning around and going that way, and so they would cut off which, so I don't know. And then I think it's only John's gospel that said that has and he healed it, which always reminds me of, I think it's William Shawn, who was the editor of the New Yorker for a long time. He said, when you're writing something, he was just a stickler of an editor. So, never, when you're writing a story, just talk about a man taking his hat off if you've never described him putting the hat on. Never have somebody cut off an ear unless you're going to have the ear put back on. So you've got that Gethsemane. We kind of skipped over how much time we have left here? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? What do we have left? 5 minutes? 5 minutes. All right, then we're going to skip over the Last Supper. It's not that important. Go back and read about the last. I mean, it's a Passover meal, and this is one of the few places where you have this big overlap verbatim between the Gospels and Paul's letters. One of the things that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, he says, remember, and this is, I guess, it's in many, worship services, right? I delivered to you what was delivered to me on the night in which he was betrayed. And it's almost word for word what you find in Luke's Gospel about the institution of the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. That Passover, the motif of remembrance that goes back to the Exodus accounts of the first Passover. All right, so you have Gethsemane, you have then the trial beginning. You remember any highlights from the trial thing? We talked a little bit about it, but what are some of the things that you remember from the trial of Jesus? Peter's denial, he denies him 3 times. And in Luke's gospel, it adds the detail on the 3rd time when he says, no, it wasn't me. And it says Jesus looked at him and fixed him with a gaze, and he felt convicted in his heart in this very, very emotional way that it's described. So Peter's denial, and then we'll see how that he gets rehabilitated, I guess you could say, in the resurrection stories that come next week. What else about the trial or anything else before the actual putting Jesus on the cross? Parts of that story that you remember. That's right. Yeah, you got him being shuttled back and forth between Pilate and Herod. Is this your jurisdiction, or has he done anything wrong? And they keep saying, he's not really done anything wrong. One passage I'll read because it's had a long history. I've kind of already sort of alluded to this. In Matthew 27, as part of that process, Matthew 27:25, this is sometimes called the blood curse. While Pilate is trying to decide what to do with Jesus, he says, this guy's done nothing wrong. Shouldn't I release him? And in Matthew's gospel, after he says, I'm innocent of this man's blood, see to it yourselves, And then the people as a whole answered, his blood be on us and on our children. And that's when he releases Barabbas for them, and he hands over Jesus to be flogged and crucified. His blood be upon us and on our children. That gets cited often in the Middle Ages. Like I said, it's called the blood curse. It's like here the Jews themselves are calling down the curse on themselves as Christ killers. So it's had a long and unfortunate history. One hope, I want to read that, and I think that there may be reason for reading it this way as kind of a double entendre, right? His blood be upon us and on our children. That you can read that not just as, yeah, we'll take the hit for this. We're calling out for this, but his blood be on us and on our children. How else could you read that? And what else does Jesus' blood do according to Christian writers? Like atones for your sins, right? So, that's how I want to read that. It's not always been read that way. But that's a really moving scene. Lots of times people, in Passion Week will kind of reenact it in some way and have the people themselves call out, no, give us Barabbas, crucify him. So that's part of the trial with Pilate. We're going to run out of time before we get to what I want to talk about, the 7 last words that he utters on the cross. When Jesus is actually up on the cross, maybe we'll talk about that next week and kind of combine it with the good news that comes after. I don't want to spoil the ending for you, but it's not going to end with him on the cross. But we'll hold that for next week. But during the trial, you've got that blood curse. You've got Jesus or Pilate saying, behold the man, ecce homo. Also, you have this much more detailed conversation between Jesus and Pilate in John's gospel, where Pilate utters this the line, what is truth? This is the line that kind of undergraduate philosophy majors, what is truth? And it's all deep, but really this is Pilate saying, what is truth? When truth, according to the Gospel of John, is standing literally right in front of him. It's kind of like the banality of evil. I mean, in one way, he's not calling out, he's not bloodthirsty, yet he recognizes, what does he do? He says himself, this guy, he's not guilty, but yeah, I'll go ahead and flog him and crucify him anyway. The result is the same. I'm not dying to murder him, but I'm gonna wash my hands of it and let truth, incarnate here in front of me, be tortured to death. So, maybe I think we're about out of time. Are we about out of time? Any last comments or questions? I'll be back next week, so we'll talk a little bit more about what happens on the cross and then what happens after. So, yes. Is it an accepted fact that someone named Jesus died on a cross? Is that what? There is, like I said, there's very, very, very little question about that. It's just so widely attested by so many different sources. You have to kind of go into kind of odd conspiracy theories. Yeah. Yeah, what happens afterwards is much more contested, right? I mean, right, yeah, the meaning of it is contested, but it's not just Christian sources that say, yeah, this guy Jesus died, but all of our earliest non-Christian sources, as soon as you hear Jews who are not Christian and Greeks and Romans even mentioning Christianity, they say, yeah, it was this movement that started over in Palestine with this guy that got crucified, and we thought it had died out, but like a weed, it keeps popping up around the Mediterranean. So even non-Christian sources say, yeah, this guy was crucified. So, yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. We'll see you next week.